Brawlers in Brawl Stars often receive many buffs and nerfs, but this one brawler has received too many amount of nerfs and has overall fell off in the last few months. The brawler I'm talking about is Crow, but to truly understand why he is not the same as he used to be, we have to start back from his release. On release, Crow had one of the fastest supercharging rates in the game, and knowing his super, you know that his super is lethal, and having it charge super fast was overall key to playing Crow. Crow is the most fun brawler to play, and also very, very good, if not the best brawler in the game at the time, back in Brawl Stars 2017. Now moving on to 2019, every single brawler got a health and damage buff, and Crow got a massive supercharged nerf. Along with that, he also did get a reload buff, and some pretty cool skins later on in 2019. This right, Crow was probably still a top 10 brawler, but overall still wasn't the best brawler in the game because Spike had recently released and was still very, very good at that time. Around this time, brawlers then received their second star power, which for Crow was the one called Carry on Crow, which made brawlers do less damage upon shooting. This immediately got a buff from 10% all the way up to 13% for Crow, along with his other super toxic star power getting a buff as well. He later got a buff to all of his damage, and his second star power got a buff up to 16% now. At this point, Crow was one of the best brawlers in the game, if not the best brawler in the game, and he was also super rare to get, so if you had a Crow on your team, you were basically jumping for joy. You had a really good chance of winning. Crow's win rate at the time was around 60 to 70%, which knowing Brawl Stars is a very high win rate. This does not include solo showdown. And you may think this was peak Crow, but trust me, it only goes up from here. Gadgets were also added to the game, which gave Crow his shield gadget and his slow gadget. Both very versatile and both very good. There was no obvious pick between the two, and both were bought out pretty evenly. Like other brawlers, Crow had his second gadget released a little bit later, and it got an instant buff after received by a whole 1 second. At this point, people were more leaning towards the slowing toxin gadget because it just seemed better and it made it more easy to get to opponents or run away from them. Brawl Stars took notice to this and then buffed the other gadget as well, and then also buffed the slowing toxin gadget too, but even though they buffed the gadget time, they lowered the gadget shield rate from 60% all the way down to 40%. The slowing toxin gadget became very good at this point and was mainly used by all those pros. At this point, you can now see where Crow is landing, and earlier when he hung in the air, he now landed faster and it was more visually pleasing. More and more brawlers were being added to the game, and Crow stayed on top. He never really went down, and overall dominated the meta as any legendary at the time should. It was more clear to pros that legendaries were the move back then, but that is not the same as it is now, since you can use almost any rarity brawler and it won't really matter. Everything seemed to be okay with Crow, and everything seemed to stay consistent until Crow's gadget had received a pretty big nerf, and it was really detrimental to how the pros were using him. Slow gadget lost almost half of its duration time, and it seemed like Crow wasn't the same and as good as he used to be. His usage rate slightly declined, all because of this massive gadget change. Even after this, he still remained on top in S tier, just because of how versatile and how much damage he did. For the rest of 2022, he seemed okay. There weren't many counters to him, but some brawlers were getting added that were counters to him, and since he wasn't too overpowered at this point, he didn't really receive too many balance changes. So for the rest of 2022, he remained untouched. No new skins, no balance changes. But at this point, it seemed like all of the pros were using the same build for Crow, which was using the extra toxic star power, which is the one that whenever enemies fall below 50% health, Crow does more damage to them. 25% more damage, as a matter of fact. And Brawl Stars took notice to this. Supercell took notice to this and immediately took action on it midway through 2023. This star power had received a 5% damage nerf, which is actually quite a lot. Crow's main role as an assassin was, well, to be an assassin and a damage dealer. If he couldn't play that role by finishing off enemies who are low, well then, what good is he? But not even a month later, he received a hypercharge. A lot of brawlers did, actually. And Crow's was huge. In just 3 supers, Crow could do over 100,000 damage. This was obviously with the perfect timing and the perfect target lineup, and since enemies rarely ever stand still, this was not as useful as people thought it was, until they played him in Heist. Even with his hypercharge, Crow had originally gotten a low rating on tier lists, But then people started playing him in Heist, and he suddenly started to shoot up the tier list just a little bit. Crow could shred the Heist safe because it wasn't moving and it's easy to line up to. So everybody started playing him in Heist, but only Heist. because at this point so many people were getting hypercharges and it just seemed like Crow had a ton of counters. And compared to some of the other hypercharges at the time, Crow's wasn't even that good. And in February of 2024, he got some buffs, but also some nerfs. He got more knives and more speed, but did less damage and received more damage. At this time, you also couldn't charge your hypercharge anymore while it was active. And he got one final buff in April, which made it so that his boomerangs wouldn't go away if they hit walls, which was more just a patch than a buff. But I guess we can take it. And to this day, he still remains not that good. He is probably the worst legendary in the game and one of the worst hypercharged brawlers in the game as well. Being at his worst he's ever been right now, will he ever get better in the future? Put your ideas down below, and if you have any fixes that you might want to add to him if you were a dev, make sure you comment it down below as well. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you like and subscribe.